Now, today we will hear from Acting Secretary of Defense Patrick Shanahan and General Joseph Dunford, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and David Norquist, performing the duties of the Deputy Secretary of Defense. Secretary Shanahan, although you are not a stranger to the subcommittee, this will be your first time testifying before us, so do welcome you. Welcome Deputy Secretary Norquist as well. Good to see you back in an appropriations room. General Dunford, I do believe that you have testified before the subcommittee annually since 2013 in 3 different roles, which must be some sort of record. I realize this will be your final time before us, and I would want to take this opportunity from the bottom of my heart, I think for all of us, just to thank you for just being a stellar human being and for your service to this country. You've just been terrific to deal with. Gentlemen, in your written testimonies and previous briefings for the fiscal year 2020 budget request, it is clear the department is going to great lengths to tie most decisions to the priorities laid out in the National Defense Strategy. While I disagree with several aspects of the NDS, I do think the document provides an accurate assessment of the strategic environment and generally points the department in the right direction. However, as with many ambitious plans, the question is, how are we going to pay for it? For the next 2 fiscal years, it is impossible to answer that question without discussing the Budget Control Act, also known as the BCA. The initial impact of the BCA caps was admittedly severe. However, the Department of Defense has received a total of $264 billion in base budget relief from the caps since 2012. Most of that occurred in fiscal years 17 through 19, when the department's budget increased by 13% in nominal terms. The fiscal year 20 budget request proposes another increase of 4.9% or $33 billion. Further, there are about $11 billion in unfunded requirements and priorities requested by the services and combatant commands for fiscal year 2020. Even the fiscal year 20 budget request recognizes that the funding increases of this magnitude are unsustainable and slows the rate of growth across future years. In the out years, the department claims that it will be able to prioritize modernization by relying on savings, reforms, and efficiencies that have been notoriously difficult to achieve in the past. I do wish the administration can muster the same courage to attack the BCA caps with the same relish it is using to implement the National Defense Strategy. Rather, the department's budget request eschews the caps by using the overseas contingency operation accounts, which are exempt from the caps, to fund base activities. In both fiscal year 20 and fiscal year 21, the budget requests nearly $100 billion in OCO to base to support the National Defense Strategy. These OCO for base funds are in addition to traditional OCO, which is projected to exceed $60 billion in each of those years. Admittedly, OCO for base is not a new concept, but the amounts requested in the budget are staggeringly out of proportion with prior efforts to avoid the caps. However, in fiscal year 22, after the BCA caps sunset, OCO for base disappears, and traditional OCO miraculously shrinks to $20 billion. People's cynicism about this approach can be understood. I must also say that as a member of the legislative branch, I am grossly offended by the unconstitutional actions taken by the executive branch to fund the construction of an unauthorized wall on our southern border, using funds that Congress declined to appropriate for that purpose, and over the denial of this committee and others, the Department of Defense is in the process of conveying billions to the Department of Homeland Security. There is no emergency at the border that requires the use of the United States Armed Forces. We are here to appropriate funds needed for the military, not to make good on a campaign promise. It is in that same vein, last night, that Congress was notified that OMB will be submitting a $377 million supplemental request for border security. A portion of that will be in support of military personnel deployed at the border. There will likely be questions on the cost and value of the troops deployed to the border. So I'm going to ignore that for the time being. But I cannot ignore the fact that Congress is still waiting for OMB and the Department of Defense to send over a comprehensive supplemental request to address the extensive damage to key military installations for national disasters. Just yesterday, the Commandant of the Marine Corps said one of his biggest challenges is getting assistance to rebuild Camp Lejeune. We heard similar comments from the Air Force leadership earlier this year about Tyndall Air Force Base. And I am baffled by the administration's decision not to prioritize the rebuilding of these very important installations. With that, I do thank you for appearing before the committee today. We will ask you to present your summarized testimony in a moment, but first I would want to recognize my colleague, Mr. Calvert, for any opening remarks he has.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, General Dunford, Mr. Norquist, welcome. We appreciate your appearance before the subcommittee. And General, also, I want to congratulate you on a job well done. I know you're probably happy about this being your last time to come before Congress, but we certainly appreciate having you here. And I know that you have done fantastic service to this country, and we all appreciate it very much. As you prepare to depart, General, we certainly want to get your assessment of readiness, given your vantage point of seeing across the services for many years. The budget submitted by the Department dovetails with the National Defense Strategy, which calls for more of a focus on near-peer threats. Well, however, the recent bombings in Sri Lanka show that there's still violent extremist groups willing to conduct suicide bombs to achieve their goals. It doesn't cost a lot of money to plan, coordinate, and carry out these attacks that can kill hundreds of innocent citizens in minutes. The Taliban has also announced its spring offensive. They killed 4 of our troops in Afghanistan just a few weeks ago. And despite nearly 2 decades of fighting, we clearly still face threats emanating from that region. While we have rightly been focused on the Middle East, our adversaries surged. We now need to redouble our efforts to ensure that the U.S. remains a beacon of strength around the world and can remain competitive across a spectrum of threats. We must build and enhance our technical superiority, strengthen our cyber capabilities, provide the best training and equipment for our men and women in uniform. I look forward to working with Chairman Visclosky and the rest of the members of the subcommittee to ensure the department has the resources it needs. I do want to point out to my good friend, the chairman, that the wall is authorized. We did the Secure Fence Act in 2006, and we partially appropriated funds for about 700 miles along the southern border. Our good friend Jerry Lewis was involved in that at that time, along with Chairman Rogers. But I know that's one of our more ticklish subjects to talk about, and we may have disagreements on, but we do have a problem along the southern border, and I hope we can address it in a meaningful way. But I'm sure we'll be having those discussions today, and I certainly thank our witnesses. Thank you all for your service to our country, and looking forward to hearing from you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. The full committee chair, Ms. Lowy, for her opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is a pleasure for me to welcome Acting Secretary Shanahan, General Dunford, and I too join our colleague in wishing you the very, very best. It's been an honor for me to interact with you, to learn from you, to work with you, and our very best wishes. And of course, Acting Deputy Secretary Norquist, thank you all for your service. In the last 2 years, the world has become more dangerous, with adversaries seeking to harm the United States and our interests around the world. The Department of Defense's ability to address an evolving threat landscape is of paramount importance, and the security of our nation, as well as our allies, depends on your service. While I am pleased your budget focuses on readiness and further strengthening our military, I'm concerned by the short-sightedness of shifting nearly $100 billion into OCO accounts. I know it's been said before, but maybe it has to be said again, so I will proceed. Your fiscal year 2020 budget for this subcommittee requests $697.263 billion, which includes a staggering $163.98 billion for OCO. The OCO request is further divided into two categories: OCO at $66.7 billion and OCO for base activities at $97.9 billion. Of the $97.9 billion for OCO for base, $85.2 billion is requested for the operation and maintenance account, which funds readiness for all of DoD. We owe it to our service members and their families to put forth serious spending proposals. The idea of using OCO spending for base requirements is a thinly veiled attempt to skirt budget caps and increase defense spending without a complementary increase for non-defense spending. Moreover, requesting OCO funds for base is fiscally irresponsible, as costs to increase end strength dovetail in future spending bills as service members receive raises and eventual pensions. Our service members deserve the stability and to know they will be taken care of in the future, and the administration's proposal makes that look less likely. Our national security apparatus does not exist in a vacuum. It relies on the health and stability of Americans and our economy, and this requires adequate budgeting and investments in both defense and non-defense priorities. So I thank you for your service, and I look forward to your testimony.
I now recognize our former chair and the ranking member on the full committee, Ms. Granger.
Thank you, Chairman Vislavsky. I'd like to welcome today's witnesses, Acting Secretary of Defense Shanahan, General Dunford, and Mr. Norquist. Thank you for appearing before this subcommittee. I first would like to recognize General Dunford, who served with distinction as the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff since 2015, and you'll step down from this position in September. General Dunford, thank you for all that you've done, your many years of service, and we look forward to hearing your assessment of the military readiness today. Thank you for being here. For almost 2 decades, our military is focused on the threat of terrorism, and counterinsurgency efforts have dominated our military planning. We're now at a very important crossroads. The National Defense Strategy emphasizes a shift to deter and, if necessary, defeat more traditional adversaries such as Russia and China. Unfortunately, the recent Easter Sunday attacks in Sri Lanka showed we have to remain vigilant against violent extremists around the world. To guard against all of these threats, we have to work together to build on the gains we've made with our allies and our partners, develop more advanced weapon systems, and recruit and retain highly trained personnel. The Department of Defense is also being asked to play a supporting role at the southern border, where law enforcement agents and officers are beyond overwhelmed. I've been to the border many times, and I can tell you this is indeed a crisis. We thank our soldiers and our military personnel for the work they're doing to keep our country's border secure, and we're going to have to do more. I know members of this committee agree that supporting our national defense is one of the most important roles we take on as members of Congress. We've accomplished so much over the last 2 years, but we have work to do. We must avoid unnecessary delays in enacting next year's funding for the Department of Defense, and we need a budget agreement that prevents sequestration Otherwise, the gains we've made together to rebuild our military will be reversed. Chairman Vislosky, thank you again for holding this important hearing. I look forward to hearing from our distinguished witnesses, and I thank them for their tireless service to our country, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Secretary, you can proceed, and then General Dunford would ask, for the sake of time, so members have a chance for a dialogue. If you could hold your summaries to about 5 minutes or so, that would be preferred. Thank you very much.
Chairman Vislosky, Ranking Member Calvert, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to testify in support of the President's budget request for fiscal year 2020. I'm joined by Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Joseph Dunford, and the Department's Comptroller and Chief Financial Officer, Mr. David Norquist. It has been a great privilege and honor to serve alongside the men and women of the Department of Defense. And it was a pleasure to work with Secretary Mattis to craft the 2018 National Defense Strategy. Released in January 2018, that strategy laid the foundation for restoring military readiness and modernizing our joint force for an era of great power competition. I now oversee the continued execution of that strategy, which is the undisputed driver of today's budget request. It was extremely helpful for the Department to receive authorization and appropriation bills on time at the requested top line last year, which marked the first time in a decade a defense appropriations has been enacted by the beginning of the fiscal year. The strategy you supported last year is the same strategy we are asking you to fund this year. The $750 billion top line for the national defense enables DoD to maintain irregular warfare as a core competency, yet prioritizes modernization and readiness to compete, deter, and win in a high-end fight of the future. This budget is critical for the continued execution of our strategy, and it reflects difficult but necessary decisions that align finite resources with our strategic priorities. To highlight some of those decisions, this is the largest research, development, testing, and evaluation budget in 70 years. The budget includes double-digit increases to our investments in both space and cyber, modernization of our nuclear triad and missile defense capabilities, and the largest shipbuilding request in 20 years when adjusted for inflation. It also increases our end strength by roughly 7,700 service members and provides 3.1% pay increase to our military, the largest in a decade. Now to the specifics. The top line slates $718 billion for the Department of Defense. Of that total, the budget includes $545 billion for base funding and $164 billion for overseas contingency operations. Of the OCO funds, $66 billion will go to direct war and enduring requirements, and $98 billion will fund base requirements. To round out the numbers, $9.2 billion will fund emergency construction, including support for hurricane recovery and border barrier efforts. Here I must note the Department appreciates this committee's support for hurricane recovery. Thank you for approving the $600 million reprogramming, which will help start our recovery efforts. I ask for your support for the hurricane supplemental to address the remaining $1.8 billion needed in FY19, as well as the budget request of $3 billion in military construction and operation and maintenance to continue recovery efforts in FY20. As this committee fully understands, no enemy in the field has done more damage to our military's combat readiness in years past than sequestration and budget instability. And there is no question today our adversaries are not relenting. In short, we cannot implement the NDS at sequestration levels. Sequestration would not only halt our progress in rebuilding readiness, growing our force, modernizing for the future, and investing in critical emerging capabilities like AI, hypersonics, and directed energy. It would force us to cut end strength and critical modernization efforts that ensure we outpace our competitors. A continuing resolution would also hamstring the department. Under a CR, we cannot start new initiatives, including increased investments in cyber, space, nuclear modernization, and missile defense I just mentioned. Second, our funding will be in the wrong accounts. And third, we would lose buying power. We built this budget to implement our national defense strategy, and I look forward to working with you to ensure predictable funding so our military can remain the most lethal, adaptable, and resilient fighting force in the world. I appreciate the critical role Congress plays to ensure our warfighters can succeed on the battlefields of today and tomorrow, and I thank our service members, their families, and all those in the Department of Defense for maintaining constant vigilance as they stand always ready to protect our freedoms. Thank you.
Secretary General.
Chairman Visklowski, Ranking Member Calvert, distinguished members of the committee, thanks for the opportunity to join Secretary Shanahan and Secretary Norquist here today. It remains my privilege to represent your soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. While much of our discussion this morning is going to focus on the challenges we face, it's important I begin by assuring you that your armed forces can deter a nuclear attack, defend the homeland, meet our alliance commitments, and effectively respond should deterrence fail. I believe we have a competitive advantage over any potential adversary, defined as the ability to project power and win at the time and place of our choosing. But as members of this committee know, 17 years of continuous combat and fiscal instability have affected our readiness and eroded our competitive advantage. As the Secretary highlighted, China and Russia have capitalized on our distraction and restraints by investing in capabilities specifically designed to challenge our traditional sources of strength. After careful study, they've developed capabilities intended to contest our freedom of movement across all domains and disrupt our ability to project power. With the help of Congress, starting in 2017, we began to restore our competitive advantage. Recent budgets have allowed us to build readiness and invest in new capabilities while meeting our current operational requirements. We can't reverse decades of erosion in just a few years, and this committee knows that as well as any. This year's budget submission will allow us to continue restoring our competitive advantage by improving readiness and developing capabilities to enhance our lethality. It proposes investments in advanced capabilities across all domains: sea, air, land, space, and cyberspace. This year's budget also sustains investments in our nuclear enterprise to ensure a safe, secure, and effective strategic deterrent, the highest priority of the department. We've also taken steps to more effectively employ the force we have and build the force we need tomorrow. We've implemented fundamental changes in our global force management process to prioritize and allocate resources in accordance with the Secretary's National Defense Strategy. We do all this while building readiness and the flexibility to respond to unforeseen contingencies. And because two members raised it early in their comments, I can assure you that as we have made these adjustments to our global force management posture, we're also addressing the sustained requirement against violent extremism. We've also redefined our process for developing and designing a future force that will enable us to pair emerging technologies with innovative operating concepts. In closing, I'd like to thank the committee for all you've done to support our men and women in uniform and their families. Together, we've honored our solemn obligation to never send our sons and daughters into a fair fight, and with your continued support, we never will.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I get to my question, I just want to point out, I think everybody agrees here that we need to come to a budget agreement. Certainly our collective national defense is at risk if we don't do that and do it on time. But, you know, as you all know, we all know here, it takes three to tango in the budget process, not just the White House, but the Senate and the House. And so all of us need to get together as soon as possible and come up with a top line number, not just for this budget year, but I would hope for the next budget year. And then we can try to separate this appropriations process from the political world out there, and that we can do the right thing and pass these bills on time. And I'm sure we can all agree that that would be a great goal to have. Since all of you are here today, I thought I'd ask a topical question about our own hemisphere and the resources we've obviously the Southern Command is not something we put a lot of resources in, but it's all of a sudden it seems to be more important with what's going on in Venezuela. Maybe you can give us a report on the latest in Venezuela as of this morning.
Thank you, Ranking Member Calvert. You know, we're obviously watching the situation very closely in Venezuela. The President's made it clear that all options are on the table. To date, most of our actions have been diplomatic and economic. We certainly were prepared to support the life and safety of civilians, American citizens, when they were there. They were safely withdrawn some weeks ago. Situation's a little bit unclear today from our perspective between Maduro and Guaido, Guaido being a legitimate member of the government. We're doing what we can now to collect intelligence, to make sure we have good visibility on what's happening down in Venezuela, and also be prepared to support the President should he require more from the U.S. military.
Thank you. General, in our hearings, we've been talking obviously a lot about Russia and China for obvious reasons. However, what happened in Sri Lanka last week, which killed 290 people and injured at least 500 who were at churches, hotels, shows that we can't let our guard down when it comes to violent extremists. To that extent, can you tell us in this setting more about the attack? How sophisticated was it, and how was it funded?
Ranking Member Calvert, we're still working with the Sri Lankans to get the exact details. I don't want to make news in front of the Sri Lankans in terms of what they know. My assessment was it was very sophisticated in terms of the simultaneity attack and the techniques that were used by the Sri Lankans. I think it exposes exactly what you talked about, which is the fight against ISIS is not over, and the underlying conditions that feed it, violent extremism, still exist, and it highlights the need for us, even in the context of great power competition, to make sure that we have a politically, fiscally, and militarily sustainable approach to violent extremism, because some people have called it a generational problem, and I wouldn't take issue with that characterization of how long we'll be dealing with this.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
President Trump met with Kim Jong-un in June 2018 and February 2019 to discuss denuclearization and sanctions relief. However, intelligence suggests that North Korea has started rebuilding key missile test facilities, although there is no sign of an immediate launch. On April 25th, Kim Jong-un met with Vladimir Putin in hopes of securing Putin's support for the North Korean regime, sanctions relief, and a gradual, not quick, disarmament plan. Mr. Secretary, have there been any discussions or negotiations between the United States and North Korean officials since the latest summit between President Trump and Kim Jong-un?
The denuclearization of North Korea remains the primary objective. Diplomacy is the primary track. What I can tell you militarily is we have not changed our position, our operations, or our strength, and are continuing to conduct readiness exercises in the event diplomacy fails.
To your knowledge, have the North Koreans resumed any nuclear enrichment activities or missile testing since the Vietnam summit?
I'm not aware of any.
And can you share with us any information you may have on the recent Kim-Putin summit? And were there any agreements made that will impact life on the peninsula?
You know, what I would share is that the sanctions that we continue to impose will stay in place, and we'll be vigilant on maintaining those sanctions.
And following up on that, could you describe the relationship between North and South Korea? Has anything changed after the latest summit did not achieve any agreements?
The relationship continues to evolve. There are ongoing activities in terms of coordination. I'm able to ask General Dunford to talk about some of the recent exercises that we've had between North Korea and South Korea and ourselves.
Chairwoman, in terms of North and South Korea, the basic question is, has the relationship changed? And I don't assess that it has. South Korea has not had taken any material steps different than the previous agreements with North Korea. What the Secretary is alluding to is our exercises, and what I can assure you is, working with the South Koreans, we're continuing to conduct exercises that maintain an appropriate level of readiness, not only for our forces on the peninsula, but for the Combined Forces Command, which is both South Korea and the United States.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Granger?
Mr. Secretary, I don't ever recall being more outraged about an issue than I am about the electronic health records program. The hearing we had with the defense health managers a few weeks ago was terrible. I can't believe that these program managers think that it is acceptable to wait another 4 years for a program to be implemented when we spent billions of dollars and worked on it for over a decade. There seems to be no sense of urgency, and our service members and veterans are the ones who are suffering while they're waiting for the DOD and VA to get their act together. I recently heard a story from a Vietnam veteran about the problems he had with his medical records. He is dying today. He's dying, and they could never confirm or find his medical records for his treatment. I hope you realize how absolutely incensed and infuriated most of us are about this. We can't wait later, and I want to know how you make it a priority and how you get it done.
First of all, I apologize for any lack of performance or the inability of the people that testified before you to characterize the work of the department in this very vital area. I personally have spent quite a bit of time on the new DHA plan on how do we merge together our medical treatment facilities, how do we deploy the electronic health records. In particular, in the Northwest was the first deployment of the electronic health record, one at Madigan Army Hospital, Bremerton Naval Base, Whidbey Island Naval Air Station, and then Fairchild Air Force Base. That rollout and implementation was successful. This past fall, there's been a considerable amount of learning that's occurred from that. The next implementation of the major implementation of this system, and this system is what's going to drive the benefits of the DHS, is scheduled for this coming September in California. I can give you the commitment that the corrective action and the lessons learned from the first implementation will be carried forward into that implementation in California. It's training, it's process. It's not just the electronic health records. We recognize that we owe it to our service men and women to take care of them. I mean, you have that commitment from me. This implementation is vital to getting the benefits of delivering higher level care, and the deputy and I will deliver on the commitment we have made to you and to our men and women.
I certainly hope so. We got a feeling of, well, we made a change of direction, and that's going to take 4 more years, and that seemed to be fine with everyone on the panel. It was not fine with all of us.
It's not fine here, and we'll come back and brief you to make sure that what they communicated was truly accurate, because we've been holding people's feet to the fire to get these MTFs integrated, but we owe you a better answer, and 4 years is unacceptable.
Thank you. On another issue, can I do another, still have some time? It has to do with the, we talked earlier about the space and the Space Force. I had a briefing recently that was astonishing to me, because I said we don't really know enough of what we're doing. The case was made that it's a very, very important program. But I think it would be very helpful for us to have more information about it and the way forward so we can be supportive. I would hate to lose a program like that just because we don't really understand what's going on.
We're thinking about organizing a space day up here on the Hill so we can brief members and their staff in a, I'll say, less DOD-like vernacular, and really being succinct and clear on what the benefits and the resources required to implement the space agenda.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentlelady, and before I recognize Ms. McCollum, I would simply associate myself and my concerns with her question about medical records, but I think I speak for everyone. Ms. Lowy, Mr. Rogers, Ms. Granger have been particularly active. And for some of us who have been on the committee for a period of time, we have basically had the same conversation with different iterations for 17 years. And we are concerned that people move this ahead. Ms. McCollum.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. General Dunford, I wish you all the best in your next mission, which will be retirement of some form, so all the best. Mr. Shanahan, thank you for the opportunity to visit with you and share some of the issues that concern both of us in the Department of Defense, which covers many, many aspects. But I'm going to focus on what I consider what I like to bring to the table, and that is focusing on the health of our servicemen and women, as well as making sure that they have the equipment and protection to complete their mission and come back home to their families. So one of the areas in which I kind of feel like I have a little bit of dual capacity is climate change and dealing with public health issues of air and water. When it comes to climate change, we had a discussion about what is going on. We're an Arctic nation. We need to pay more attention to the fact that we're an Arctic nation, and I look forward to working with you and the chair for this committee to receive more briefings on how we can prepare our posture for up there, work with our allies on the issue, and also address some of the infrastructure needs that we're going to have and equipment in there. The other issue that we had an opportunity to talk about is in environmental issues. So I'm going to ask you not only ahead to work with the chair, as you had said that you were planning on doing on briefings on the Arctic, but also to prepare for us as a committee the effects of climate change. It's a national security issue in other countries. We get that. The reports are out there, but it's also a national security issue from what it's going to cost taxpayers to build resiliency into our infrastructure here or infrastructure that we're going to have to move. And we're going to have to start, I think, really addressing that and holding that out in the budgets. With what's going on, as the chair pointed out, it wasn't a foreign entity that caused the damage that Hurricane Michael and Florence did last year, and we're still struggling with getting those bases up and running. So I would look forward to working with you on those issues. I am going to ask you that we have this discussion a little bit to allow you to clarify something on the record with what's going on with the EPA, what's going on with the Department of Defense, and some chemicals that are referred to as PFAS. And I hold up, and we talked about in the office, a New York Times article, and I quote from it. After pressure from the Defense Department, the Environmental Protection Agency significantly weakened a proposed standard for cleaning up groundwater pollution caused by toxic chemicals and contaminated drinking water consumed by millions of Americans that have been commonly used also at military bases. So you had an explanation for what the Department of Defense is working on. So I'd like you to, on the record, tell us what the Department of Defense is doing, what you see as an appropriate cleanup level, whether or not the Pentagon, in fact, is pushing for weaker standards, and what is your commitment to the health and well-being of the servicemen and women that get up and go to work every single day. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I look forward to hearing from you.
Absolutely, and thank you for the question on the health and well-being of our service members is, besides national security, our number one priority. Just maybe to kind of keep all the items on the record. No one's drinking contaminated water at the over 400 sites in question. In terms of the use of these chemicals, we no longer train with them. We no longer test with them. The only use of them is in the event of a fire. The real work here is on remediation, which is, I think, the line of questioning. And what is played out in the media is the DOD advocating for a lesser standard than the EPA. And what I would say is we've agreed with the EPA on a common standard, and it was their standard. I think if we pulled apart where the discussions were occurring, it was on the processes to be used to implement the EPA standard. And we've been working to a set of Superfund processes. Where we are right now in the harmonization of using the EPA standards out for public comment, but I think in working with you and others, do we have the right standards, really now the question before us.
Mr. Chair, and I appreciate the question that you put before us. Do we have the right standards? We'll continue to work on that. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Roger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, welcome. General Dunford, congratulations on a brilliant career. We wish you the best in the next chapter. It's been 10 years, at least, since we've heard the same assurances before this subcommittee and other committees of Congress about the medical health records. It's incredible that we can't get this fixed. In the meantime, we've got young veterans dying, going blind, suffering interminable illness because of bureaucratic crap. Each agency, veterans and DOD, have had their own systems, refusing to build a link between the two in order to give VA the medical information that it needs to help a veteran wounded during the fighting. My colleagues have heard me tell this story 1,000 times. Young man from my district who was injured in Iraq from a bomb. One eye was destroyed, the other severely damaged. They brought him to Germany and operated to try to save this one eye successfully. Not fully, but fairly well. Well, this eye then, as he becomes a veteran, becomes infected. So he goes to the Lexington VA hospital. They can't get access to his records from Germany. There's no way to get it. They knew he had been operated on, but they could not operate because they didn't know what had been done before, and they were afraid they would kill him. So he turned him away, and of course he went blind. That's inexcusable. And Mr. Secretary, I've heard your predecessors say, hey, we got it on the way, it's going to be here, the fix is in. Well, that's been 10 years, and we've poured billions of dollars into this seemingly simple problem. Why can't we have the computers marry? Can you help me out here? Don't promise something you can't deliver, but deliver.
I'm not going to promise you something I can't deliver, but I can maybe explain in part the difference between why these two computers can't talk to one another. There's a degree of interoperability. It has to do with information like what's General Dunford's date of birth, or where is his home address. The real issue has been on the passing of the actual records. I don't know. I can't explain to you the technical complexity of that, but that's been the crux of the problem. I owe it to you and this committee to deliver on capability. I promise, to do my best. I'd love to be able to sit here today and say, let's draw a line in the sand. I can deliver this capability. We delivered on the first instantiation there in the Northwest.
We've had your staff people before this subcommittee on this question numerous times. It's been a constant barrage of questions from members of this subcommittee to you and your predecessors and your staffs. So you've known how strongly we all feel about this, and yet we're told it's going to take another 4 or 5 years. in the meantime, we're going to lose a lot of young soldiers who sacrificed their health in the defense of this country. I can't believe that we have not already solved this problem. General Dunford, do you have any thoughts about this?
Congressman, the last time I touched it was in a previous assignment, so I don't have anything to update you on. In my current assignment, I don't touch the specific issue every day, so I don't have any details on where we are.
Well, we sit here waiting. And, Mr. Secretary, we're going to hold your feet to the fire on this. Get it done. It's time. It's past time. And you've heard the chairman of this subcommittee and his strong feelings about this subject as well, much more important than mine. But we're going to stay with this again. And it's not going to take another 10 years or another 4 years. Get it done now. Stop the suffering. Thank you.
Mr. Kilmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to each of you for being with us and for your service. I used to work in economic development in Tacoma, Washington. We had a sign in my office that said, "We are competing with everyone, everywhere, every day, forever," which I always found somewhat intimidating, but was a pretty good ethic, not just for folks who work in economic development. It's a pretty good ethic when we look at our national security challenges as well. I know part of the strategy is to focus on some of our near-peer competitors, the great power competition with Russia and China, and was hoping you could speak to that issue. Obviously, Russia and China have been modernizing while we have dealt with CRs and sequestration, which I think has certainly hindered your ability to engage to the level we need to. You've made clear that your top priorities are modernizing our armed forces to face these future threats. I was hoping you'd just take a minute or two, because I want to touch on another subject as well, and talk about how your budget reflects that focus and where your top priorities are in terms of our capacity to stay ahead of Russia and China.
Well, let me just follow on with the electronic health record here in setting up this comment. The priority in the budget is China and Russia in terms of the capability we have to address. We don't have a lower priority, and sir, we're going to fix the electronic health record. We can walk and chew gum at the same time, but you have our commitment, and I'm sure you've been told this many times, but we're spinning a lot of plates, but we won't drop the ball on our veterans and service members. But in terms of the prioritizations and where our investments, much of it is in modernization. We haven't modernized in 30 years. And there are, if we went to the Army, you'd see 6 different programs, but I would just say that at a top level, the emphasis is on space, cyber, and new missiles like hypersonics. And what you'd find in the budget, even though we've built it up with OCO for base, the way we constructed the budget last year is the same way we constructed it this year, and we're continuing to put greater and greater investment into modernization. I spoke to the fact that this is the biggest research and development budget in 70 years. Cyber is a significant investment because of kind of all the threats that we face today. That's probably the fastest evolving one. It's also the one that is easiest for people to develop on their own.
The other issue, and this to some degree is germane to the concerns around healthcare. I think all of us are concerned about the rise of suicide among active duty service members over the last few years. Worry that community stability has somehow become frayed. I know that that's a priority for each of you at that table, and I'm hoping you can speak to some of the work that the department is doing on this front to address issues around suicide, to hopefully rebuild the sense of community and relationships that hold service members and their families together, and ensure that the department is there for those who are serving when they most need our support.
Congressman, I'll start and express the same concern that you did about the rise in suicides. This is an issue that in several assignments I've been decisively engaged in it and looked hard at it. Probably the most promising thing I have seen is the multidisciplinary approach to healthcare. You can see that here in Washington, D.C., in the National Capital Area at the National Interpret Center of Excellence, and we have satellite National Interpret Center of Excellence sites around at our military bases and installations. We don't have them everywhere, but we have them in those areas where there's the highest incident and the highest need, particularly for those returning from deployment. As you know, one of the perplexing challenges is that there's no common trend in terms of suicides amongst our active duty population. We can clearly see a correlation between deployment history and veterans. There is not a similar correlation between deployment history and the active duty population. But I guess to answer your question succinctly, I think it's the comprehensive approach to mental health care that includes leadership, the chaplain, the medical professionals, all in one place, having a common visibility about a soldier, sailor, airman, and Marine, and make sure we're dealing with the whole individual and not a compartmentalized approach to their care.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Mr. Cole?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, good to see you. General Dunford, let me just join everybody here. We are all very much in your debt and very appreciative of the service you've rendered our country. I'm going to use this occasion, Mr. Secretary, to talk about something that you can't do much directly about, but maybe you can talk to a couple of people that can. And I'm going to take the same opportunity to talk to the chairman of the full committee and my boss, the ranking member of the full committee. And I was asked earlier by another member, what are your top 3 priorities in the defense budget? And I said to avoid a shutdown, to avoid sequester, and to avoid a CR. Didn't have anything to do with the programs. I just want to do that. And because the budget looks pretty good to me, broadly speaking. But to do that, we have to have the President of the United States talk to the Speaker of the House, talk to the minority and majority, or the minority leader in the House, and obviously the majority leader in the Senate, minority leader in the Senate, and get us a set of numbers. I mean, right now we're going to mark up a bill at some point, and we're going to do it to notional numbers. They're not real numbers because we don't have an agreement. And until we get that agreement, everything we do is at risk. Now, I pick up this morning's paper and I read that the President and the Speaker and the minority leader in the Senate were all talking about an infrastructure bill yesterday. Wonderful, great, $2 trillion. How about we focus on what matters, which is our really day-to-day budget. Let's get that deal first if we would worry about the next one, because we will stumble along this summer, and if we're not careful, we're going to put you guys right back where we've put you until last year for the first time in 10 years, where we actually got you a budget on time and you've had a year to implement it, and believe me, things are better. I see it in the facilities in my district at Fort Sill. I see it at Taker Air Force Base. Things are better because they had a budget, they could plan. They're moving well on their respective missions. So I just say that, go back to the White House and ask them to sit down and with the appropriate people and get a budget. They are the people responsible for running the country. You can't run it without a budget. I also want to associate myself very much with our subcommittee chairman, the committee of the full thing. This OCO thing is a gimmick. We all know it's a gimmick. I know you have to do. Look, I know who you work for, and I know that OMB, sets these things up. And I've been in enough budget negotiations to know that that's all a budget is, the opening round of a negotiation, and people try to position it. But this is more unrealistic than most initial positions to negotiate from. That it's not going to stand. And when each side starts off with, I'm going to get everything I want, and you're going to get nothing that you want, nobody's going to get anything. And to wait to the last minute, which I suspect is where we're headed, is a mistake and a disservice to you and the men and women that you lead. We are better. We should be better in governing than that. This is our problem, not yours, but it is an administration problem as well. They have to participate in this. And it's a leadership level, not at this committee. At this committee, if you leave the appropriators to it, they'll get you a deal. I always said if I can put Nita Lowy and Kay Granger in the same room, I'll solve the problem in about an hour. And they'll come out and they'll put us all to work with our respective numbers, and what we're supposed to do. And I would just suggest that the leadership of the Congress and the leadership of the administration needs to be as capable as our chairman and our ranking member are. We'll get this done. Again, not your fault, but I hope you carry the message back, because everything else we're doing here is futile until we have that deal. We have a number. You guys can plan. We can work with you to get to where we need to go. I do have a question real quickly, if I may, and Mr. Chairman, thank you for indulging me in my rant. But Secretary Shanahan, you described an 80% readiness target for mission-critical aviation platforms that you'd like to achieve. I got Tinker Air Force Base in my district. They do wonderful work, great work. They're a big fan of General Kirkland, big fan of General Levy before him. But we ain't anywhere near 80% mission ready in the platforms they're dealing with, or anybody else that I know is dealing with. So, again, I want to achieve this goal. What do you need to achieve this goal, and where are we at in reaching that goal?
The 80% target was for F-35s, F-22s, F-16s, and F-18s. The real emphasis was on F-35 and the F-18s. So when we think about B-52s and B-1s, it's an unrealistic goal. So we didn't target those platforms. The F-35s being brand new aircraft, that should be the baseline where we start. So the Navy's made significant progress with the F-18s. I think they're on track to meet the goal in September. I can give you the number, but it's somewhere like they've recovered, 50 to 60 more aircraft in the past 6 months. It's been a tremendous amount of progress. The F-35 will come home. We're going to drive that home, but we wouldn't set that bar across all of the platforms. F-22 has struggled, and I think the F-16 is a bit of a high bar, but it's a lot of iron to keep on the ground, and given all the training missions and the productivity we can generate, I think holding that standard is smart for now.
Well, I applaud you for the standard, and we'll certainly do everything we can to work with you, because we've got a lot of money invested in these platforms, and we've got a lot of flyers that aren't getting the airtime they need in terms of readiness as well. So, again, just want you to know that's a very high priority for me. I'm sure it is for everybody on the committee. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
Aguilar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Acting Secretary and General and Mr. Norquist. Mr. Acting Secretary, the DoD revealed that not only will the Pentagon be sending 320 more troops to the U.S.-Mexico border, bringing the total number to 3,200, but it has also been disclosed that the rules will also be loosened so that some troops can interact with migrants. This represents a significant amount of resources going toward a mission that has no end in sight. How will this perpetual deployment affect troop readiness, and describe how making such a deployment will not interfere with the multitude of missions that the armed forces are already engaged in?
Thank you for that question, and this is an issue that General Dunford and I work on quite a bit, because the question that he and I really are trying to answer is, how long will we be at the border? So, to date, if you go back in time, we received our first request a little over a year ago in April. And it was, I think, we've really been on this kind of a la carte approach where we've been asked to support DHS. We have. It's, traditional that the department supports the civil authorities, whether it's, hurricanes or what have you. We're now in a position where we need to ask the question, how long will we be there? And when we've gone through and looked at the conditions of the border and borders and CBP's ability to actually perform their duty, they're thousands of people short. And so we've initiated a set of actions to really understand kind of how many people are they short, because we need to get that into a sustained environment. We're driving buses, we're serving food, we're doing medical support, we're doing logistics support. For now, we haven't degraded any readiness, but we really need to get back to our primary missions and continue to generate readiness.
Yeah, because the department also presented this committee a list of unfunded requirements totaling $8.3 billion, and the department's estimated $9 billion in hurricane and storm damage that impacts troop readiness and morale as well. Yet the department's overestimation for FY19 end strength resulted in $1 billion, and so you have these two buckets of unfunded requirements and potential disasters to be mitigated, and yet we choose to send $1 billion to a priority that has not been funded. So why, with all of this going on, do we need to send $1 billion in military personnel funding for the president's border wall?
Well, we need to secure the border. I mean, this is a.
I understand that. All of us agree with that.
Right, right.
So why is it your responsibility? Why isn't this not a DHS priority to be worked out with Congress?
The simple version is I have a legal standing order from the Commander-in-Chief to deploy resources to support a national emergency.
Do you feel that you also have a constitutional authority to follow the will of Congress?
I have a legal standing order from the Commander-in-Chief.
So does the department intend to continue to ignore our responsibility for the power of the purse?
We won't ignore.
But you did.
You know, we're following the law. It's within the law for us to be able to utilize these funds. It's within the law. I wouldn't break the law.
Okay. Can we expect anything else within the supplemental related to personnel? Judges, lawyers, drivers, transport, that $377 billion supplemental that the chairman mentioned. What will be contained within that?
Did you say billion or million?
I'm sorry, it was million.
Yeah. No. I think it's the.
I don't want to make news there.
Yeah,
that.
No. Just to be clear, I believe, and I'll ask David to clarify, but that is our estimate for this year. David?
Correct. That's the estimate for the year, but many of the functions that you talked about are those that are ones that we are performing in support of CBP, the bus driving, the food, the others. But the 377, I believe, or just under 400 is the cost associated with the support for the year.
Yeah, I guess I'm still struggling with the policy, Mr. Acting Secretary, on at what level you feel you need to continue to backfill CBP operations. But I'll move on quickly. Could you give us an update on, there's a program of interest to me and a lot of us, the Information Assurance Scholarship Program that performs DoD cyber scholarships. How is it performing currently? Where do you see this going in the future? And how important is it to prepare future cyber warriors within the department?
Right. Well, the scholarship and the recruitment and the retainment of cyber professionals is probably the greatest skill challenge that we have in the department. You know, there aren't enough software engineers in the world, and there probably never will be. The skills that we've developed inside the department are world class, and the ability to recruit and retain is within Cyber Command, within each of the services, within the NSA, is probably our biggest threat. The scholarship program, I don't know the particulars of its effectiveness. I know that every place where we've put a program in place, it's worked, and we should be doing more.
This program is housed within the Chief Information Officer budget within your office, but it's something that Congress has funded the past few years, and we look forward to working with you on it.
Thank you for that. Yep.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Norquist, General Dunford, thanks again for your service. I join my colleagues up here in congratulating you on a remarkable career. At the risk of beating a dead horse on EHR, but I join my colleague from Texas and my colleague from Kentucky in voicing some concerns about it. But to be fair, it is a shared responsibility. I mean, if you're going to marry platforms from two different cabinet agencies, it's a shared responsibility. So can you enlighten me on what your conversations with Secretary Wilkie have been like in the marriage between these two systems, it seems to take such a long time at such extraordinary expense?
Before undertaking these duties and responsibilities, I spent quite a bit of time with Secretary Shulkin and then with Secretary Wilkie on putting a governance process in place, but more importantly, making sure that there was enough crosstalk on the requirements in terms of the interfaces and how this data interchange would play. I haven't talked to Secretary Wilkie this year, given these responsibilities. I'll accept the responsibility of the fact we have to go deliver on these systems. I mean, I own it now, but I don't have any other kind of updates other than the ones in the previous where we put the actions that with David Shulkin and with Secretary Wilkie, we identified the critical deficiencies. That's where we spent our time. What are the critical deficiencies and when will they be corrected?
Well, I don't know a lot about the IT community, but I do know this. Former Secretary Shulkin made a decision. At least he was able to make a decision on an acceptable platform, and why we are now this far down the road without any action. As I said, I share the concerns of my colleagues, but I want to talk about another information technology issue, and that is with a simple question: why does your department continue with what I believe to be an ill-conceived strategy on a single vendor Jedi cloud program? There's been a down select to two organizations that, in my strong opinion, continues a disturbing pattern of limiting competition on a program that is potentially extremely expensive. We don't know just how expensive it's going to be, but and I have strong concerns about how the approach by the Department of Defense in this arena seems to be geared toward, producing a desired outcome with a specific vendor. So I'll leave it there, but I'm concerned about Jedi.
Well, digital modernization is probably one of the most important undertakings the department has. So for us to be successful in cyber, we have to be able to protect ourselves. So the cloud is one element of infrastructure that we're modernizing. The fundamental premise on our approach to the JEDI implementation was to have competition. And this is an important underpinning of that competition. Preclude vendor lock. Okay, so we want to be locked into one supplier, just like in the situation we have with electronic health record, have flexibility if things aren't working out. Across the department, there was a proliferation in terms of implementing clouds. Everyone was moving to the cloud. The JEDI competition is about creating a pathway so that we can move as a department on a small scale. This isn't wholesale. It sometimes gets advertised as this is winner take all. This is winner take all for a very small subset of the amount of cloud infrastructure we're going to have to build out over time. Besides creating competition, we're creating the standard processes so that the department can migrate, so that we don't have each and every department trying to figure out how to move to a cloud.
What conversations did you have with the intelligence community? I mean, they've gone, they have the same issue, correct?
Correct.
And they've developed a strategy, correct?
Yep.
From single vendor now to multi-vendor. So was there not an informed pathway established by the IC that has been working in this arena that's going in a totally separate direction than what the Pentagon's going?
Actually, we worked very closely with the agency, and then the person who led that effort has come over to lead the effort in the department, so that we could take what they the conversations we had with them was, if you could go back in time, what would you do differently? And so we're taking what they learned from their experience and translating it into what we're doing.
Well, all I'll say, and I'll leave the subject, is that it is clear that multi-vendor cloud environments are widely used by large organizations for a simple reason. They increase competition, they improve security and capability, and they provide cost savings. And in an environment like we're in right now, I would assume that that would be a key issue for our Department of Defense. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I get to a couple questions, first of all, thanks to the three of you for being here. And I did want to offer an invitation to visit the Rock Island Arsenal. It is literally on an island in the middle of the Mississippi River. And we'd love for you to come, especially to see our new Center for Excellence in Advanced and Additive Manufacturing. So I just wanted to extend that if that would fit into your schedules. So just a couple questions. I'm going to start with looking at the make or buy guidance. And it was in September of 2018 that the department released a report that's called Assessing and Strengthening the Manufacturing Defense Industrial Base and Supply Chain Resiliency. Just rolls off your tongue. So the broad takeaway in that is that the report highlights the need to sustain our organic industrial base elements like depots, the ammo plants, arsenals, in a way to address the supply chain vulnerability and maintain some level of workforce that's needed to address the industrial base needs. So one of the great challenges is the predictability of the workload to maintain and sustain the workforce and make sure that we keep up capabilities. In the Army, this make or buy guidance, it's supposed to inform the procurement officers on their decision to use the private sector or some combination of the private sector and the arsenals. I have some concern about how that's working, and so what I would ask of you is, can you discuss how the department is working with each of the services to ensure that their respective make or buy or equivalent guidance or regulations are addressing the needs and the challenges identified in the report from last September?
Now, the report from last September talks about the investments we need in order to bring work back or to invest in critical capabilities, right?
Correct.
Yeah. So the the specifics of each service and the business case, if you will. I can't speak to case by case. I mean, I'd be happy to make available the people that kind of talk through how that decision, how those decisions are made.
Okay.
I think in terms of the Rock Island Arsenal and arsenals in general, we kind of think about the National Defense Strategy and modernization. There, in this report, there are two big opportunities right now. One is, if we're going to bring work back, and there's certain capabilities that are in China, so that would be like at the top of my list.
Okay.
Why don't we make them organic, right? So I mean, that's one. And then the second piece really is, as the Army in particular starts to modernize, we know the surge in industrial support to a lot of these suppliers is going to be quite high. In fact, this predictability, that's another opportunity. And I would just offer we'd be happy to work with Rock Island Arsenal to pursue what I think there are real opportunities in the future where we're not moving work from one place to another. It's really new work.
Right. I don't know, Mr. Norquist or General, if you have anything to add, I would appreciate your thoughts on this as well.
Well, I know that the Army is paying particular attention to this as it affects the Rock Island Arsenal with the up armor of the heavy equipment transporter and other items. But you raise a good point, which is part of what drives the cost of each one of these organizations is what level do I staff to? What's the level of workload that's coming through my organization? When I visited a number of depots, one of the questions I'd ask them is, I'd say, look, we have these maintenance backlog issues. What are you hiring up? Are you addressing them? And part of their concern is, well, what's my funding going to look like next year? When am I going to receive it? And so when we talk about the point that Congressman Calvert raised about the budget on time, the CR and so forth, those consequences are not just at our level, they're down at each of those organizations who's trying to plan a level of workload that minimizes the cost. And so I think the Army's working very carefully, particularly with Rock Island, to be able to address that. But as a department, the stability of that information for those organizations allows them to operate at a much more efficient level and at a better cost, and that helps protect the department and the country.
All right, General, anything to add?
I don't have any to add on
Okay.
that issue. Thanks, Congressman.
All right, great, thank you. Just one other question. Obviously, it has been well established at this point that foreign entities willfully engaged in and meddled in our elections during both the 2016 and the 2018 elections. This is a clear threat to free and fair elections, a big concern, I think, to probably everybody sitting in front of you, and certainly a big concern in our nation. Regardless of party or political creed, this should be a basic position that we can all agree on, that we need to make sure our elections are free and fair. It's my understanding that the U.S. Cyber Command has already established a track record of working to protect our election, including disrupting internet access for Russian troll factories during the 2018 midterms. This budget requests $9.6 billion to support increased cyber warfare capacity, both offensive and defensive, to ensure we're protecting our country. Here's my question. Could you outline for our committee how this funding will grow capacity at the department to protect our country from further cyber threats and hacks from foreign adversaries? And do you foresee this funding helping provide resources or capacity that could specifically help ensure free and fair elections? And maybe, General, if we start with you and then maybe to the Secretary.
Congresswoman, I think what's a really important point is that probably prior to 2017, we viewed United States Cyber Command as a tool that was used for what we called an away game. A major policy shift that we made in 2017 was to bring the full weight of the United States Cybercom to bear in defending the most important thing to our nation, which is our democratic process. And so you can't separate what Cybercom does in protecting our elections. In other words, in 2018, that was absolutely General Nakasone and the team's #1 priority in the fall of 2018. And as you've suggested, even in this venue, we can say that they had some significant success. And the capabilities that they'll continue to develop will be brought to bear in 2020 and beyond, just like they were in 2018, in support, certainly, of the primary organizations, domestic organizations responsible for elections. But I can assure you that under the Secretary's leadership and his predecessor, our approach was, what's the most important thing right now to our country? Defending our elections. What is United States Cybercom's #1 priority? Defending our elections.
Mr. Secretary.
No, I would certainly echo what the chairman has said. If we decompose the incremental $9.6 billion in the budget and we were in a classified setting, I would walk you through program by program where that money is going. Last summer, a host of us met with General Nakasone. Over the course of 4 months, we went through and said, what are the future investments that need to be made to stay ahead of the threat? What are the capabilities so that we can get after new threats? And then where do we need more capacity so that we can grow this and address, other areas in the department? So that's the level of detail that's within the budget. But for a while they were being not starved, but I think some of the attention being placed in recovering readiness had limited the growth. That's why this year we have it's an over 10% increase in their funding.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me, we've discussed a little bit, and I'll pose this to anyone who wants to answer it at the table. But as you're well aware, there's a significant difference between the FY 2020 defense requested funding and the BCA caps if a new deal is not reached. And can you just discuss a little bit about how you see this would impact the department overall, and if there are any contingencies that you currently have in place they would address the funding discrepancy that we would see at such a magnitude?
So I think the core of your question is, what's the effect of a return to sequestration to the Department of Defense? And I think the clear point is it would be catastrophic. When you first thing you'd have is you'd have undone a significant amount of the readiness gain that this Congress and this administration has spent so long investing in. When you realize that you hire about 270,000 military personnel a year, reducing their training, that's a group that needs to go through, needs to get the same level of both the advanced, the basic and the advanced training. When that's disrupted, there are consequences. We've seen improvement, in the number of Army Brigade combat teams that are ready, going from 18 to 28. You'd end up going backwards. Then you'd also have the very point that the Congresswoman over here raised, which is the disruption to every depot, every installation, every organization that provides a service that counts on that level of stability to run Abram tanks or other things through maintenance, now all of a sudden getting a dramatically reduced order that they're still trying to manage with a workforce that was designed for a higher level. So I think it would be disruptive for readiness. It would be a major step back for our security, and it would introduce costs into the system that are unnecessary. And I'll leave it at that unless the chairman or secretary want to add in. I would just make the point that it's a 25% cut. And so it's, not something you just do some belt tightening exercise on. And, at a macro level, you'd either decide to invest in modernization and furlough quite a few people and take a lot of risk in terms of security, or maintain current force structure and then forego investment in modernization. But it'd be really, in essence, undoing of the national defense strategy.
And Congressman, as we have the debate, I think probably in simple terms, we ought to look at it really in three categories. One is it's about the support we provide for our men and women in harm's way. That's going to be impacted. Two is it's our ability to deter potential adversaries. That's where we're going to see the impact. And three, it's our ability to respond if deterrence fails. So this is fundamental to our strategy. In other words, appropriate level of resourcing in this budget and the last two budgets have been directly and inextricably linked to our ability to execute the national defense strategy and sustain that competitive advantage I alluded to in my opening remarks. And I don't have any doubt that our competitive advantage will continue to erode and put at risk our ability to project power when and where necessary to advance our national interests in the future, were we to go back to the BCA. There is absolutely no question in my mind about that.
Thank you. Let me just shift gear just a second. It seems that after a meeting last December, each of the service branch now has its own hypersonic offensive weapon program, but we're waiting for new boosters to be developed. We have boosters already in production of a 50-inch size, my understanding. If there is a study that claims that these boosters are too expensive, could our office get some detailed information on that particular issue? And I think if possible, it would be best to field a limited number of weapons using what we have now. My office has been discussion with Dr. Mike Griffith with your office, and of course, just encourage you to reach out to him because I think he has some real insight on that.
We'd be happy to do that. And as you know, Dr. Griffin is leading the effort to make sure that we leverage as much commonality between the three services in terms of bodies, boosters, energetics, as many things as we can to be able to accelerate our deployment of hypersonics. But we'd be happy to coordinate with your office.
All right. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Mr. Secretary, Mr. Norquist, and General Dunford. Thank you for your lifetime of service to the Marine Corps and to our country and to your fealty to the oath that you've taken. We respect your service very much. Secretary Shanahan, thank you so very much for your openness to meeting with members of this committee. On the issue of hypersonics, could you please provide to us the future year defense plan for hypersonic test chamber funding and the sites associated with future funding, the factors that were weighed in the selection of the 3 test tunnels, and also I understand that the department is willing to consider other sites that would be less expensive, that are fully equipped, and prior to making final decisions. Is that my understanding?
I believe so. I've done some homework since you and I have met, and the basic selection criteria in determining where to do the hypersonic testing looks at existing capability, whether it's mothballed or not, just what is, it'd be like the size of a wind tunnel or basic performance. Then there's existing infrastructure, and then realism of being able to, have a representation of what a flight environment would look like. I know that our team is going to take a visit to Plumbrook, and maybe it's serendipity, but it was actually this week. So I know there's been some selections this year, and then there's ongoing studies in 20. The exact funding I'd have to get back to you with.
I just thank you for the dialogue and your interest. Thank you so much. I wanted to ask General Dunford or any of the panelists, what more can the United States and our free world allies do to gird Ukraine for the upcoming winter season against the possibility of Russia turning off the gas?
Congresswoman, I can talk to what we're doing to help Ukraine defend itself, and I think we're providing defensive weapons and capability. We're also providing them cyber expertise. I don't have any details on exactly what we're doing or what we might do to help them with their fuel problem in the wintertime. We can take that for the record and get back to you.
I would be very grateful for that. I'd like to know if there's any thinking anywhere along the lines regarding that. I also, General, in the budget that has been submitted, you specifically referred to the Intrepid Center, which I am so impressed with. My question is, are there additional funds in this budget to replicate that in other places in the country? And again, I have to speak for my region, where we don't have big bases. We have Guard and Reserve who also come home who are wounded warriors, including on the behavioral side. Is there any funding? How does one replicate some of the superb work that's being done at the Intrepid Center in other places in the country?
I'll take the first crack at it, Congressman. First, thanks to some help. Those were privately funded by the Fisher Foundation, so the actual infrastructure was provided to the Department of Defense. What you'll see in the budget, of course, is the funding for the medical support that goes into those facilities. And so we're always in a competition. The Secretary spoke earlier about human capital for cyber. We're in a fight for human capital for some of the medical specialties that are necessary to field these multidisciplinary medical facilities as well. And so in the budget, we can get you the exact details. Where you see requests for medical support, a piece of that will be to support not only, I use the NICO, but that's not the only multidisciplinary approach. Each of the services has been moving in that direction in a comprehensive way over the last couple of years, and that's part of the budget.
I would just point out that nationwide we have a severe shortage of psychiatrists, over 100,000. And in the behavioral arena, among advanced practice nurses and behavioral specialists, probably 5 times that much. Our chaplain corps is burned out, in my opinion. And when we had the heads of West Point, Annapolis Air Force Academy before our subcommittee, I was quite disappointed when I asked them the question, when you recruit for young people to come into the officer corps, do you have a level of physicians, individuals who might be interested in medical careers? And I asked them how many each of them had graduated, and the number was generally 5 or under. I was actually shocked at their lack of connectivity on this particular issue, but also the responsibility that they might assist with as we try to help the military. So I just make you aware of that conversation. And finally, though none of my colleagues may agree with me on this, I just wanted to express an opinion about our border. I live way at the northern border. But in terms of the southern border, I think that what we are facing is a series of failed states and people who are fleeing for reasons that the United States is not responsible for. After World War II, we, through the military, and I am very uncomfortable with the U.S. military deploying to our southern border. That's a slippery slope. But there is some experience in the military with displaced persons camps. And if one looks at resettlement and the proper care of individuals, the military really does have some remarkable history on that in Europe. And I think that the United Nations, through their resettlement programs, we need a diplomatic solution here, not just a policing solution. And I don't see that developing. And I think we could really do something remarkable working with our Canadian allies, with our Australian Costa Rican, you name it. We could help people find safety. And I don't see that happening. I see a lot of political argument and all the rest. And the human side of this is getting lost. But maybe the military, based on its experience with large numbers of people who were displaced for reasons dealing with war, the world was transformed by that moment. And I think there's some history there that needs to be relearned. So I just wanted to state that, and I thank you for your testimony this morning.